Folks, welcome to a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. And as I've interviewed my heroes in jazz, I have made many important discoveries, not the least of which is the advent of the hand drum in the jazz idiom. It started with Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie and became a fixture in the soul music scene of the late 60s. And all of a sudden, percussion instruments like timbales, vibes, chimes, gongs became integrated into the musical melting pot. Still, the drum comes from Africa, and its indigenous sound creates a warmth and pulsating rhythm that is infectious, but also intimidating to those who are in power. My guest today has been a leading musician, advocate, and teacher for the drum from his days in Chicago to being part of the Max Roach drum ensemble MBOOM, and his loft in Chelsea represented the longest standing and consequential jam room in New York City. I could go on and on and on, but let's hear from the man himself, Warren Smith. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. Warren, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes. Hey, yesterday I was in a Christmas daze, and for some reason I was in a bit of a funk, and I just I got on the piano with my daughter and started to play, and then I put on some other stuff, and I started to play my hand drum, and it just broke me out of that funk, and it just, there's something about music that no matter what, it can turn your mood around real quick in a positive way.
That's very true. Yeah, I have that same reaction myself usually. You talk a little bit about this album with Ken McIntyre in 1962, the year of the Iron Sheep. How did you get connected with him, and where were you in your career at that point? Well, I had been in New York I came in 1957, so that was about 4 or 5 years into my life here in New York. Ken McIntyre had come up from Boston. And another friend of mine, Jack Jeffers, who is still around and very active, he has his own band, which I am a part of, and he also plays with the Duke Ellington Orchestra when they go out on tour. Anyway, he introduced me to Ken McIntyre, who had come to New York and was looking for a drummer who was a proficient sight reader. And when we got together, we found out that we had several commonalities. Both of us were school teachers, and we both had families with young children at that time. And I started working with him, and the relationship lasted more than 30 years.
What would you say at that point? What was the music like? I've never had a chance to listen to the album. It sounds quite remarkable, but at that point, were you just playing on the trap set, or were you bringing in other percussion as well?
I hadn't really started doing that. As a matter of fact, I can actually credit Ken McIntyre with the incentive to do that, because he knew that I was a percussionist. I guess he had found out some things about me. I had done a lot of that in school. And at that point, I was actually doing a lot of Broadway. I had started working my second year in New York. A friend of mine was working in the West Side Story and got me in as a substitute.
Oh, wow.
And as a result, I did the last 7 years of the show on its original New York run and went on the road with them for a year and a half while they did the national tour. I left the show early on the tour and came back to New York and started working again. And that was about 1960. The show picked up again in New York in 1960 and lasted until maybe 61 or 62. And then I did 2 or 3 other Broadway shows, but it was right about that time when I met Ken McIntyre. And we started working together in his small groups. He then went up to Wesleyan University in, Middletown, Connecticut.
Yes, of course.
And I would go up there and perform with his group there. And he
We also went out to, where was it, in Ohio? Wilberforce, one of the historically black college and universities.
Yeah. I don't know offhand, yeah.
I'm trying to think of which one it was now.
It'll come to you.
But at any rate, I went out there a couple of times and worked with him, and then finally, that was before he went to Wesleyan. Then he came back to Wesleyan, and from there, I would go up there and work with him on a regular basis, and it was during that time that we recorded The Year of the Iron Sheep. And then he started teaching at the State University of New York in Old Westbury. And he founded the program, so he brought me out there with him because I had a master's degree at that time, and that was the traditional credential that they were using for you to get entree into the university. So we went out to Old Westbury together in 1971.
Unbelievable.
And we both retired from there.
I don't think I mentioned this to you before, but I'm from Stony Brook.
I'm sorry, you're fading in and out on me, Jake.
Yeah, no, I'm from Stony Brook, Long Island.
Oh, you're from Stony Brook?
Yeah, so I mean,
really?
I love can you talk a little bit about this school in Old Westbury? I read about it, but it's just confounding to me, you know.
Well, what it was John McGuire had gone. He was an administrator at Wesleyan University, and he became the president to start that school. And so he started it with a very, how should I say it, radical bunch of professors. You know, we were coming from all over the place, and all of us were, there were a lot of different political definitions to us, you know, some conservative, some radical, liberal and whatnot. But we were all thinkers, you know. And so within that group of people, Ken McIntyre and I came into that, and we started the music program. What was unusual about the program was that this was one of the first times that we had an opportunity to start a program with a black ethos.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the president was also aware of the fact that we needed something like this somewhere within the college system. We had a student body that was 1/3 black, 1/3 white, 1/3 Hispanic, and 10% international people. And a lot of them were Army veterans who had served in Korea and Vietnam. And this made the student body rather radical also. And, we did a lot of experimentation with non-grading, just like a pass and fail and whatnot. But we had to compromise that issue because some of our students were graduating and wanting to go on to grad schools, and they had to have more traditional credits in order to get in. So we came back to the regular grade system. But we were able to accomplish quite a lot. The performing arts program encompassed African dance, African American music, and theater that was, I would say radical theater. We were doing plays by all sorts of writers. We did the Song of the Lusitanian Bogie by Peter Weiss,
Wow.
who was from Switzerland, but it was very critical of the apartheid area in South Africa and the diamonds that were being mined by Africans and then, used to build up the wealth of the European world, things of this sort. And so it was really a very heavy political experience, as well as establishing jazz as part of the curriculum in our music department.
At that point, correct me if I'm wrong, but most music departments were basically classically driven, right? There really weren't a lot of jazz departments at that time.
That's right. This was before they had started the Berklee School of Music and before a lot of the other schools. In fact, I think we were probably the first one in the SUNY system to start a jazz program. We were the first ones that graduated people in the entire 68-school SUNY system, which had a concentration in African American music, dance, and theater. And our people were immediately going into other professional organizations. Like several of our students from that program went right into the Sun Ra Orchestra and the Dollar Brand Orchestra. I'm trying to think what his name is. What does he call himself?
Yeah, he's got enough. I wanted to go back to Jack Jeffers for a minute.
Yes.
I remember talking to a guy who was writing a book on jazz in Boston from the 40s and 50s. Wasn't Jeffers in a band with Charlie Mariano, or was he in the other band with Jackie Byard? They were in. There was like a white band and a black band before things kind of crossed over. But he was up in Boston doing some stuff up there.
This was in Boston, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Who was in that band?
Jack had experiences in both of those bands, I'm pretty sure.
And at that point, did you know him then, or were you in Chicago at that point still?
Well, no. Jack actually was serving in the Army. He hadn't gotten out of the Army yet, and he was stationed down at Fort Dix.
Wow.
And we were both in an amateur training symphony orchestra. And so I would see him at I think we had rehearsals maybe 2 times a week. And so I would see him pretty consistently, and we just became good friends, and were involved in a lot of different things of that sort. That being on the periphery of symphonic music and jazz, I remember we did a project down at Cooper Union that involved composers like Charles Mingus, George Russell, Gunther Schuller, and it was a big orchestra that they were experimenting with a combination of classical written music with improvisation.
Wow.
And so I got involved in that, and there again, I had met Gunther Schuller when I was at the University of Illinois, because he came out there to do a residency, and he remembered me from that experience. And I met George Russell and later became part of his band in the 1980s. And I worked with Mingus when he did that big town hall concert, the Epitaph concert, the original one, and was involved in that and also in that project's reincarnation. But it seemed to be there was somehow a symbiosis between me and a lot of people from Boston, because Jack Jeffers was from Boston, of course.
Jackie Byard was from Boston.
Our association was mainly in New York City.
Yeah, there was a pipeline from Boston to New York and back and forth. But you looking back on it, Warren, talk about. I interviewed Dave Brubeck, and he's in his 90s now, and he basically, for all intents and purposes, took a lot of credit for desegregating or having the first desegregated band in the Army. But I wanted to ask you about how much your era, your generation of jazzers from the 50s and the 60s, how much it had to do with racial tolerance, how much it did bridging a gap as far as civil rights. I mean, how much of a significance did jazz play in the civil rights, in progress being made in civil rights?
Well, it was a struggle in those days, because, first of all, being involved in Broadway shows, I was almost invariably the only black performer there, and that gateway was broken open by black shows coming on Broadway and using all black pit orchestras, and that kind of opened it up a little bit. But of course, I wasn't the first person to do Broadway shows. Joe Wilder was in many Broadway shows years before I came to New York, maybe 10 or 15 years before that. And, but the symphonies were not yet integrated. One of my classmates became the first African-American in a major symphony. His name is Ortez Walton. He was a bass player that I went to grade school and high school with. he wound up auditioning for the Boston Symphony. And for the first time, they initiated a process where they auditioned people behind a curtain so that they couldn't see the contestants.
Wow.
And would be forced to only grade them on their performance. And Ortez won that audition and became the first African American in the United States in the symphony orchestra, or at least in a major symphony orchestra.
Go ahead.
These things were happening at the same time.
It's funny that you mentioned they would do it behind the curtain, because when I talked to Richard Davis, he would talk about, whether it was classical bass or in a jazz setting, a lot of times he would never get a call back because they saw he was easily the best one, but he would never get a call back. Period. So it's interesting they started to do sort of the masked or the auditory only audition, so they couldn't write him off because of the color of their skin.
Well, that was exactly the purpose. And Richard did audition and get into the New York Philharmonic, but he was so busy doing other types of music that he didn't stay very long. He stayed, I would say, less than 2 years in that orchestra and then branched out. Hubert Laws went into the New York City Ballet Company as one of the flautists in that orchestra. And as a matter of fact, I was in the New York City Ballet Company as a percussionist as well. And, there were, but all of us were actually jazz musicians who were trained in college as symphonic performers. And of course, we had the ambition to do both music. It's not a matter of not loving one kind of music over the other, but it was just a matter of the racial barrier was extremely rough in those days. In fact, you don't see too many African Americans in symphony orchestras even today.
Right, that's true.
That's 50 years hence.
That is a very good point. I just, when you say it's rough, I was born in '78, so I don't have that perspective. But to me, I look at it and I say, okay, it was more overt. If you hated a black person, you called them certain names, you even beat them or whatever. But at least it rallied around the cause. Whereas today, you see with Barack Obama, there's this it's so covert. Everything's covert to make him look sort of impotent, and it's so transparent to me, my generation. In some ways, it was like a real cause back then. It was more overt, and therefore it drove more rational people to say this is just flat wrong.
Well, I'll tell you, my point of view would be a lot different.
Go ahead. Go ahead, man.
34,
Yeah.
So already by that time, I had lived through a lot of those experiences that really crystallized my opinions of American society, and probably certainly not in a positive sense. But I view all of these things, even now, with the kind of obstruction that President Barack Obama is going through. I have a hard time not relating a lot of that just to pure racist objection to his presence in the presidency itself.
I would agree with you.
And there are a lot of things, that could be better for the country from an economic standpoint, certainly from a capitalistic standpoint, if these things were somehow abolished, but that is not going to happen. It has to be something that people live through and live down. And my greatest hope is that with things like the Occupy Wall Street and just people getting out on the street all over the world, that there will be a better attitude towards these sort of things in the future. But we have a lot of work to do to make it happen.
Well, Warren, the thing is that we're at a point where we need so much innovation and ideas, and they're all there. But you know what?
Yes.
Okay, if Barack Obama is seen as solving all these major problems and pushing us into the 21st century as a leader, a black man gets the credit to being the greatest president of all time. And there's just too many white politicians who don't want that to happen. The solutions are all there. It's about who's going to get credit for it. And they're going to obstruct him until, even if he wins re-election, it'll be 4 more years of this stuff, and there's enough people that will sit on the sidelines and and there's a variety of things, but I go back to this old Westbury school, and I say to myself, there must have been local politicians and other people, influential people in the area that supported that kind of thinking, because it's very avant-garde, and in today's society, the media would get a hold of it and turn it into some sort of crazy lion's den.
Well, you see now I've forgotten what the law that the Supreme Court allowed to go through that allowed moneyed interests to be able to put unlimited funds.
Yeah, Citizens United. Citizens United.
System.
Citizens United.
You know what I'm talking about. I can't call the name of it right on hand, but it's in existence today.
Yeah.
And my opinion is that when that kind of excessive wealth is manipulated in a negative way, that a lot of things can happen that are detrimental to the world economy in general. You know, and my fear is that unless those things are resolved, that we will indeed have another financial depression like the one we had in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
I lived through the end result of that. I wasn't born until 1934, but everybody was still going through that well up into probably the start of the Second World War. And I remember the conditions very well. You know, actually, the people that I was around seemed a lot kinder and a lot more thoughtful of more needy people than I see in evidence today.
Yeah.
And I just hope that it wasn't, that we wouldn't have to get back to that attitude by going through a full-fledged depression where everybody suffered until we can, you know, wake up and, you know, make some changes for the better.
The case that you're referring to is Citizens United.
Citizens United.
Yeah, and yeah, that opened the floodgates, and actually, I think they're gonna. The Supreme Court is also going to continue to play a detrimental role this year because of the sort of the rigidity and the conservatism on the court. But you know, at the end of the day, I agree with you. I think through the example of the world events, you know, in the Arab world, and the idea that there's a lot of younger people, younger than me, different generation, who are looking at huge debt and not a lot of hope. The fact that they're out there. They need support, and to keep it going will only allow the process or the debate to become more rational, more civil, because right now it's all ideological.
Yes.
You know, I wanted to ask you, did you go into the South Bronx a lot when you first moved there to see salsa music? Would you go see Tito Puente?
Yeah, I did. I actually lived in the Bronx. I lived in, well, there were two areas. I first came to New York and moved to Manhattan. I actually had cousins living in Harlem. And so I was able to see a lot of that evolution between the 50s and the 60s of what was happening in Harlem. And I also saw the salsa renaissance in the Bronx because I was there. And there was also, I moved to Brooklyn, I think, in 1961 or so, and lived there for about 3 or 4 years. And there was a tremendous renaissance of jazz happening in the Brooklyn boroughs that was important enough that most of those musicians wouldn't bother to come into Manhattan. And as far as the salsa thing was concerned, most of them stayed in the Bronx. They didn't bother to come downtown either, except that the Palladium was very active, and that had a whole ring of salsa around it also that was developing at the same time. But I think that the real experimentation and all the sessions and stuff were happening primarily in the South Bronx.
Yeah, I think Ray Mantilla would concur with that. When did you first run across Ray? Because he was the one that first brought me to, I mean, I was aware of you, but then when he mentioned that there were only 3 remaining members of MBOOM left, and you were one of them, it kind of piqued my interest. When did you meet Ray?
I met Ray, well, see, Ray was playing with Art Blakey, he was playing with Max, and there were 2 people that I knew who were really congueros. Ray was one, and then Ray Barreto was the other one.
Of course.
Rays, how about that? And I was fairly good friends. I was more familiar with Barreto because I ran into him more frequently, and I even participated in a lot of the, I'm trying to think of the Fania record label came up, and I was doing a lot of percussion.
Were you really?
Working with the Fania record label.
Oh, absolutely. No, like you were on a lot of those albums? I can't believe that.
Yeah, I was.
Oh, that's
working
great.
With Johnny Pacheco and different people like that. Joe Cuba.
Eddie Palmieri?
I knew both Palmieris and Eddie and Charlie. And, I was what they call a recording musician. I had the reputation of being able to sight read fairly well, so people would call me in to slap a tambourine or, play a vibraphone part or something, or hit a timpani note. And I was doing a lot of Motown recording then also, because they were coming up to New York doing a lot of their stuff with some of the newer groups, like Gladys Knight and the Pips.
Oh, wow.
People like that.
These are albums that of course, they don't list the credits of the accompanists on there. So I mean, it's you kind of have to. You would just come into the session. It would be Gladys Knight.
You find some of the older LPs of Aretha Franklin's records with on Columbia and Atlantic. You would find my name on there because when they were producing LPs, they were printing the names of the musicians even on the album covers.
And who was in that band? Like Chuck Rainey was in that band too?
Chuck Rainey or Jerry Jamot were the bass players. The guitarists were Cornell Dupree and Eric Gale.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl Lynch and Wally Richardson. Everett Barksdale was the elder statesman. He was doing a lot of stuff. There was another bassist named Bob Bushnell who had just... Actually, he was one of the first people that popularized the electric bass, working with Louis Armstrong and the Timpani Five. But these guys were all the rhythm sections. Herbie Lavelle before Bernard Purdy came to town, and I can't think of all of them. I'd have to really go back into my memory book.
No, you're doing pretty good, Warren.
They're still the ones that are still alive are still quite prominent.
I mean, it was such... You guys were cut from a different cloth, Warren. I mean, can you talk about... I don't want to get too emotional, but can you just talk about your generation? I mean, my dad listens to a lot of these interviews, and the thing that, he was born in 41, but I mean, the thing that he comes away... The thing that he comes away with more than anything else is just how intelligent all you guys are. You guys were rooted in education, and that is something that is missing in all parts of the Western world now. It's just the gutting of education. I mean, you guys, all of you are articulate. Like you said, you were a sight reader of music as well. I think that...
I was a sight reader at 6. I started learning how to read music at 6.
Talk about the importance of education for your generation of guys, the Cornell Duprees, the Chuck Raineys, the Warren Smiths, and the foundation and the confidence it gave you to go out and be secure enough to go play music.
Well, the first thing I would say about that was that we were culturally educated, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
We knew the music of our own culture. And we were at a place when that music suddenly became crossover and became popular. And when it became such, people who were just sight readers were not capable of handling the process of recording that music, because you needed somebody who knew the styles and the attitudes of the singers and was familiar with the whole thing. So that produced a whole, how should I say it, a whole group of musicians like those people that we just mentioned. Now not all of them initially were good sight readers, but that experience of being in the studio constantly caused a lot of us to develop more proficiently than we had been. And these things spread over into the point where a lot of commercial music needed needed those types of people to perform, so we broke into that area as well. But the education itself, there was no education for quote unquote jazz music in the colleges in those days. And if you go back to the days of Jimmy Lunsford and Fletcher Henderson and Horace Henderson, those were excellent musicians and excellent readers. Many of the saxophone players had switched over from playing violin into the saxophone when that became popular. And most of the real proficient artists on those instruments were black, because that was what was required in our dance music, which was the main way that most of us were surviving as musicians up to that point. The recording industry was like another bonus. We had what we called race records prior to that, that were only circulating among the black community all across the United States. But a few artists, I guess Bessie Smith was responsible initially, and then other people like Ray Charles came around, and Aretha that broke through that and became popular musicians. So then the white musicians started taking notice and also developing skills that would allow them to participate. And I think at that point, somebody convinced the universities that maybe this was a viable topic for study on the college level, But we were getting all that in the street or from private teachers. There were an awful lot of black private teachers who just did their whole business just teaching private students. Those were my original drum teachers, as a matter of fact.
We're talking to legendary drummer, percussionist, teacher, advocate.
Who's that?
No, I'm reintroducing you to the audience. We're talking to Warren Smith right now.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and just really a pleasure to get the insight and the history. Warren, I wanted to ask you, Armando Peraza gets all this credit for George Shearing being coming up and sort of bringing the conga drum, the Afro-Cuban rhythm, into a kind of a square jazz setting. But where did you come in on that? I mean, I feel like were you playing the conga? Did you know Armando? Like, where did you fit into that? Because it seems like you were on the scene before Armando.
Well, yeah. I don't know. These things were not new. George Shearing hit upon an arranging style that became immediately very popular.
Right.
And a lot of that was due to the fact that he had a bass player named John Levy, who was a very good businessman and happened to be black, by the way.
Right.
He managed an awful lot of singers like Billie Holiday, Nancy Wilson, and people like that, and was responsible for the commercial success of their careers. And he became George Shearing's manager, as well as the bass player. So that went along. But the thing about Shearing, I think probably he was cross-influenced by the entrance of Cal Tjader into that group.
Right.
And Cal Tjader was responsible for a lot of Latin music, particularly on the West Coast, coming to prominence. When I was traveling on the road with the West Side Story, we were in San Francisco for 6 weeks around 1959. And Cal Tjader had a band at the Blackhawks. I used to go hang out regularly, and his percussionists were Mongo Santa Maria and Willie Bobo.
Oh, yeah.
And Al McKibben was the bass player, and the pianist was named Lonnie Hewitt.
Oh, my God. The best band ever, man. That band was killer.
That was a classic band. That was the best band Cal ever had.
Yeah.
And they were quite prominent in recording and presenting a lot of hits. And, of course, where Mongo went to with his fame, he became an entity in himself. Bobo was quite famous, and he kind of died early, I think in his middle 40s or something like that. McKibben just died about a year ago, and I lost track of Johnny Hewitt. But that was a very important development in popularizing Latin music.
Yeah, they were taking jazz tunes and putting Latin rhythms behind it with guys that could really play that kind of stuff. I mean, I've done an extensive amount of work with that, and actually the thing that made Cal kind of a genius, because Cal was pretty cerebral, and George Duke told me, he's like, Cal was almost like the Bill Evans of the vibes. He'd just keep his head down and play. But Willie Bobo was so extroverted that it was like he had all the elements to a great team. It was just a great, it was just a really special unit of people, and and so many guys, whether it was Roy Ayers or George Duke. I mean, when they were growing up in high school in the late '50s, right when you were on West Side Story, their first bands that they put together were based off Cal Tjader's bands.
Yes.
It's really amazing.
Well, see, they had that connection because they were from the West Coast.
Right.
And they were probably able to have access to that music live as well. Now what happened on the East Coast, you had all of these guys in the Bronx, and then, of course, Tito Puente established a school unto itself that produced an awful lot of people. But in the meantime, Dizzy Gillespie managed to make connections with people in Cuba, and he brought Chano Pozo back to the United States with him. And I think Chano influenced Tito Puente and that whole school of people in New York to get more serious about their culture. And of course, that developed into what it is now.
This is, we have so much to get through here. This is really an amazing piece of history, and to be able to talk to Warren Smith about it is extremely important. This conglomeration of characters in MBOOM with Joe Chambers, Omar Clay, Ray Mantilla, Roy Brooks, Warren Smith, and I know I'm leaving out somebody else's name. Of course, it was led by Max Roach. Talk a little bit about what you got, if you can. Take us back to that time period, and what was what were his intentions going into it, and the whole idea. What were you guys feeling that made you come up with this MBOOM project?
Well, what happened was I had run into Max. I spent a year, or at least a summer, up in the Tanglewood music camp for the Boston Symphony Orchestra, thoroughly intent on being a symphonic timpanist or percussionist at that time, and they had just started a jazz experiment in Lenox, Massachusetts, which is where Tanglewood is, called the Lenox Music Inn. And Max was up there that summer performing there, and there was a hangout that we used to go to called Avaloq, right across the country road from Tanglewood. And the house pianist of this place every summer was Randy Weston, who was a friend of Max's. So hanging out there one day listening to Randy, I met Max on a personal level, and he encouraged me to come to New York, which I did about 2 years after that. And as things evolved, I had a studio on 21st Street in Manhattan, and Max began using it to rehearse because we had drums set up there, and we had amplifiers for a bass, we had a piano and whatnot. And Max would come up there with his quartet and rehearse Reggie Workman, Billy Harper, and I think it was Cecil Bridgewater was a trumpet player by then.
Wow.
But he, one day I wasn't there, and Reggie called me and said, Max wants to talk to you about something. And so sure enough, I called up, and he expressed this idea. He had been involved with other percussion ensembles. Art Blakey had gathered that thing together with Ola Tunji. I've forgotten the name of it, but it was more an African-centered percussion ensemble, combining jazz with African drums. And Max had done other things using multiple percussion as well, but he wanted to get an entire percussion ensemble which concentrated on the African-American tradition of music. So he knew Joe Chambers, who lived close by him. Omar Clay lived in the building next door to Max, so he knew him. And he was familiar with Roy Brooks and Freddie Waits and myself, and we were the 6 original members. That actually, we saw that immediately we needed someone who had expertise in playing African hand drums. And we experimented with Richard Pablo Landrum. But Pablo and Max had a little bit of
they were a little personality conflict.
Yeah. It was a little bit of a conflict, personality conflict. So Richard didn't last too long.
Right.
And immediately Max knew of Ray Mantilla, and he knew of Mantilla's history. He was participating with the experiments that Blakey had used. And
right.
he had also done a lot of things adding the Latin flavor to just straight jazz albums. And the difference between the two was Pablo was more of a Yoruba culture drummer and was very adamant about that, whereas Mantilla was fairly flexible within the jazz idiom as well as within the African culture. So he fit much better, and we never looked back after that. That's how the fight was. But what we did was we would come into my studio maybe 2 times a week over a period of 2 years, and we developed the literature. Everything that we played was composed by the people who were involved. And we developed a whole program of that music, and then we started performing. Max, of course, had the clout to bring us into the public. And he got us on the George Weems New York Jazz Festival, whatever it was, Newport or Cools or whoever was sponsoring it at the time, Lorillard companies, whatever. And we managed to do that. He got us a couple of European tours, and then we made about 5 recordings, which are still about and circulating as CDs.
Well, if you can get them on vinyl, they go for huge money.
Yeah.
Huge.
Those of us who have those actually kept. The first record that we did actually, now this is a part of history that I don't think too many people are familiar with.
Great.
There was a huge movement of same family instrumental ensembles. And Cornelia Smith, Stanley Cowell, and a couple of other people organized a piano choir. And at the same time, Bill Lee, Spike Lee's father, a bassist, organized a bass violin choir, which included Ron Carter and Richard Davis and just about Art Davis and all the great bass players you can think of that were in New York at that time. About, maybe 10 bassists. Brian Smith was from Chicago, and he had this gigantic 12-foot high bass that you had to stand on the platform to play, and that was part of this ensemble.
Wow.
But a woman named Novella Nelson produced a concert in Central Park, at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park, which included MBOOM, the percussion ensemble, the piano choir, and the bass choir. And at the end of the concert, we did a symphonic ensemble of the 3 groups. And the music never got recorded because Bill Lee and Ron Carter objected to our being recorded for fear that it might be used for some commercial purposes that we didn't agree with. So it never got recorded.
Wow.
But the music was done, and the memories are still fresh.
There are two things I wanted to touch on for a minute. When you talk about bringing in the Afro, the MBOOM percussion group, which was mainly African Americans, you also had Mantilla, who had the Latin background. Then you guys also had a symphonic. Many of you were classically trained. So what I'm trying to figure out is, what did this crowd look like in Central Park? It must have been very diverse. I mean, you were bringing in different types of music fans, were you not?
I don't know how we did it, man, but the transportation, Well, see, the pianist had a deal with Steinway at the time. So Steinway provided all the acoustic pianos. And then I think Sony had an electric piano. It was one of the first, but it was a huge, like, 1,000-pound instrument that had to be trucked in. So they used that and a Fender Rhodes and a couple of other piano diversions to do their part. And, of course, the bassist actually had a rhythm section with them. But all these groups were pretty much self-contained. You know, we had plenty of melodic influence in MBOOM from vibraphones and xylophones and marimbas. And, you know, we were able to capitalize on that to create our melodic intents when we needed them. And the others were just, you know, we used the instruments as African instruments to produce the rhythm. And, you know, the three groups all recorded individually. And some of those records for the piano choir and for the bass choir might still be, they'd be very hard to find, but you would find them. If anyone has the entire catalog of the Strata East Company, which was about 40 records that were produced, if anybody has that, it must be a treasure trove.
Holy cow, those records are
hundreds of thousands.
Holy cow, man. You know, I was going to ask you the other. Well, also Roy Brooks played the saw, right? He got this.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yes, that was another whole entity. Yeah.
You know, it's so funny because I was talking to the great piano player Bobby Pierce when I went out and promoted a concert this summer in Los Angeles, and he talked about this band that he was in with James Moody and Eddie Jefferson and Roy Brooks and
Oh, in Detroit, huh?
Well, they did it all over the place. I mean, I think they started out in Boston or New York, but I mean, like, you know, Moody. It was after Moody left Dizzy, but he just said that Roy, they were like a family on the road, and there'd be times when Roy was pretty. You know, he was depressed and he needed to talk, and you know, Bobby would go in and they'd really hash it out. But you know, it was one of those guys. Roy Brooks, you know, he's obviously left us now, but man, you know, what a stalwart, what a legend, but also a real kind of tortured soul at the same time.
Did you ever read that there was an independent newspaper in Detroit called Metro, I think? And they did a whole story on Brooks. What happened was that a lot of us didn't know it for a long time. Of course, MBOOM had, you know, we had such intimate experience with each other. Anytime something happened to one of us, entire 6 or 7 of us were there. You know, I lost my wife. Everybody was there. You know, something happened to Freddie Waite's wife. Everybody was there. Max's father died. We were all there in Max. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And we found out somewhere along the line that I didn't know what it was at the time. Brooks was suffering from, what do you call it?
Was it manic depression?
Yeah, but there's another name for it. But it's manic depression is actually a bipolar syndrome.
Bipolar, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the people that have this disease are resistant to taking the prescribed medicine, which I think includes something called lithium. It does something to their emotions, and it affects the way that they can perform music. So they resist taking it. And over a period of time, it creates these mood swings that we all have to adjust to for them, you know, with them. And, of course, Brooks's family knew how to handle it. In MBOOM, you know, the thing about MBOOM, you know, we're all drummers, and all of us had our own bands, and that's a tremendous amount of egos to overcome. And unless you have one super ego like Max Roach, who can supersede all the other egos in the band and command respect, it never would have worked.
Right.
We would have just been, you know, a bunch of straws blowing in the wind without Max's influence. But he knew from his own experience as a leader, and he could see things coming and getting ready to happen. And we knew how we could collectively keep everybody safe in that environment. And, you know, when Brooks went back to wound up in the Upper Peninsula of Detroit, of Michigan, in a mental facility. I found out my daughter's a doctor in Detroit. They did not have a mental facility in all of metropolitan Detroit. There was no place that could care for him, so they had to send him up to this isolated place with no music program. And he eventually somehow wound up getting a music program even in that institution. You know, but on his down times, it was just, it was more help than anybody had to give him. And he eventually succumbed to his illness up there.
Did you, Warren, ever come across, did you ever play with Hugh Masekela in the band when they cut Grazing in the Grass with the skipper Henry Franklin on bass?
I was a member of an ensemble that Hugh was in before that.
Oh, please talk about that.
When Hugh and Miriam McCabe came to New York, Harry Belafonte brought them. And I was playing in Belafonte's orchestra at that time. They also incorporated a young man who just died last week named Ralph McDonald.
I know. Oh, of course.
Yeah. We just celebrated his life last week.
Oh, yeah. Bless him. Yeah. I didn't get to him in time.
The week before. Beautiful service at Abyssinian Baptist Church.
That's great.
But that was Belafonte. He brought those people here, got them out of South Korea, which was still going through its apartheid system, and they came to New York and became stars independently. But they were married for a while, I think, when they first came, and both of them became independent stars. Yeah, but that was I wasn't working with Hugh at that time, but we worked together quite a bit with Belafonte.
Well, I was going to say, because I know Henry, he left his wife and 3 young kids to come to the East Coast, and once they became famous, I mean, the marriage kind of went out, but. It was such a conglomeration. It just seems it was all cyclical. Willie Bobo calls the skipper and says, "Hey, I got a ticket waiting for you to come to New York." He joins Willie Bobo's band. Then he winds up with Masekela. They make the album. Somehow it strikes me as there was a freedom and an accessibility, and the idea that there were really, a lot of clubs, and clubs were open later, and it allowed people to really develop their sound and get their sound out and feel comfortable up in front of, other musicians.
Yeah. You have to realize they were all very young. We were all in our 20s in those days, and life just doesn't seem to get stable. At least it didn't get stable for me until in my middle 30s.
Right.
And I'm sure we all had that same thing. So there were a lot of unstable family situations early in life. I was very fortunate. I managed to keep my family together through all those hard times, but a lot of people didn't.
Can you talk, there's this one album that I listened to you on that it's so much fun. It's called White Heat, and it was with Barry Miles and Pat Martino. And Pat and Barry and Lou Tabak, and it was kind of like the young white prodigies. And there's Warren Smith and Terry Silverlight was like 14 years old on drums.
Right, I think he was 15.
It was ridiculous. And that album is just it's white heat, But I was like, how did you meet those guys, and how did they pull you in for that session?
Well, see, in those days. I had a reputation as a studio musician, and, people that knew me a little bit better knew my jazz experience, and, I had worked with Harry Parks, I had worked with John Cage, and a whole lot of other really kind of not weird, but avant-garde composers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not the way we look at things now. They were weird then. I guess all of us were weird then.
Everybody's weird, man. Weird is good,
My reputation. That they called me in on that as a percussionist. And
one of these guys that I wanted to ask you about, one of these weird guys, was Gil Evans, who
yes.
He was When I look at the credits, the most diverse amount of percussion that you're using seems to wind up on his albums: vibes, marimba, chimes, gongs, congas. Talk about Gil and his orchestration and how he incorporated all of your talents into an album.
Man, that was the greatest experience of my life orchestrally, because let me clear my throat here.
Sure.
All right. I had three ambitions when I came to New York from the University of Illinois. I came up here and went to Manhattan School of Music to finish up. But the three things that I wanted to do was play in Gil Evans' orchestra, play in the West Side Story, and I'm doing a Rick Perry on you. But those were two of them. And what happened was, it was so ironic. I fell into the West Side Story because a former schoolmate of mine was in the show and got me in it. So that took care of that one. What happened in the West Side Story? Oh, that was the other one. Johnny Richards' orchestra was the third ambition I had. And I had actually gotten in Johnny Richards' orchestra because they had a percussionist, Willie Rodriguez, who left the band, and the substitute they got was also playing a few little notes on timpani. And they got a sub that couldn't handle all the other things. It played, the conga part's okay, but couldn't handle that. Somebody recommended me for that job, and so I was with that band for 2 to 3 years, which was a great experience. But one day I was hanging out with some of those musicians, and we went to hear Gil's band at Birdland. And ironically, the night before that, since they're both dead now, I will reveal the personalities. Two of the musicians had gotten inebriated, and it was the guitar player Chuck Wayne and the drummer Philly Joe Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And they got into an altercation and were rolling back and forth across the floor of the bandstand in the middle of the performance. And Gil, probably for the first time in his life, fired them both.
Wow.
Now, I come walking into the club, and Gil says, we're going to need another drummer for tomorrow because I just, So one of the guys in the band said, well, hey, this guy can read. Why don't you hire him? And he hired me for that one night, and I struggled along with him and played. And, I had long, heady ambition, so I said, wow, this is, bonus. I got to play all these great tunes with Gil and all these people. And a couple of years later, he formed a new band. And they were really hitting it hot. And another friend of mine, Howard Johnson, got in that band and convinced Gil to add a percussionist. So I came into his band actually as a percussionist. And the first thing I did was I said, man, I would love to study composition with you.
Mm-hmm.
He said, oh man, I ain't no teacher. Why don't you just write something for the band? I said, what? So I went home and I wrote a piece, and he put it in, and I wrote a couple other pieces, and they put it in. They recorded a couple of things. But by this time, I was like one of his assistants. I was helping him copy music, and he'd have some little thing that he wanted to do, and he said, I need 5 minutes of a love scene. Why don't you write me out something? And I'd do it and bring it in, and he was very accepting, and I did eventually wind up playing drums with him also, but I must have been with Gil for more than 20 years and did several of his recordings, but he was such a magnanimous person, that it was like having a musical father,
It's amazing that that he fired Philly Joe Jones and you took over for that. That's a great story.
Yeah.
That's a great story. Warren, in our remaining minutes here, I wanted to ask you, tell me what gives you the most satisfaction today. Do you find yourself being able to mentor younger cats who were, you can see the look in their eyes the way you had that look, or is it still actually just getting out and swinging?
Well, I just have to be thankful. I give credit. I do a lot of solo percussion now, and it comes in very handy because leading a band is a terrific responsibility, and being responsible for all your band members' personalities is even a greater responsibility, and it's something that I don't relish that much. But Ken McIntyre talked me into doing a solo percussion concert out at Old Westbury. And I was a little bit angry about it because I wanted to bring my group. So I said, well, all right, I'll show him. And I did the percussion solo concert, and I never looked back. You know, it was something that Max Roach had been telling me, here's this guy is one of the greatest percussionists in the world, and all he wants to do is be the great drummer, you know, and his drummers are a dime a dozen. You know, that's not true either, but, you know.
Right.
But they were all trying to get me to utilize all these percussion techniques that I had. And that's been a great satisfaction. I mean, I love the timpani and the marimba. Those are my two favorite instruments to play on. The drums is kind of like another appendage now. It's a natural thing. But timpani and marimba are, you know, I'm very happy that McIntyre and Max drove me in that direction, because I might not have done it by myself, you know.
Warren Smith, thank you for taking some time out of your day. It is just an honor to talk to you as I build this archive of history that will one day become a book about your generation of jazzers. And I thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you. Quite welcome. And by the way, thank you for sending me that other interview. And any others you do, I would appreciate it, because we all value each other's opinions and ideas and thoughts about life, and I love to keep up with that history, especially the current history of my contemporaries. So thank you again.